They barely let him inside. Eric Parker stood in the grand courtroom of Chicago's Central District Court, his clothes ill-fitted, his shoes worn thin. Every gaze that landed on him seemed to scream the same thing. "You don't belong here." He was Ike, 16, the son of a public school teacher who earned barely enough to put food on the table, let alone fight legal wars against billionaires. His presence was an accident, a piece no one had counted on, a witness no one wanted to believe. In the polished oak benches sat powerful men in designer suits, women dripping with jewels, reporters scribbling furiously, and a sea of eyes, looking at Eric as if he were some stray animal that had wandered in. The enormous marble columns that lined the walls seemed to lean inward, as if the very architecture of justice itself was scrutinizing him. The air felt thick with privilege and power, a world away from the cramped apartment where he and his mother lived. Eric clutched his tattered notebook against his chest like armor. Inside were pages of diagrams, calculations, and observations he had meticulously recorded. None of it was meant for this moment, for this stage. He had simply been in the wrong place at the right time, or perhaps the right place at the wrong time. The weight of what he knew pressed against his ribs like a physical thing. The case was monumental, a scandal involving the embezzlement of millions through offshore accounts, implicating some of Chicago's wealthiest figures. Eric had witnessed a transaction, pure coincidence, or fate. He had been working his after-school, job-cleaning offices in the financial district when he overheard and saw things he wasn't supposed to. Things that made his mathematical mind click into recognition. The opposing attorney, Mr. Tamburello, oozed condescension as he approached. His suit probably cost more than Eric's mother made in 3 months. "So," he drawled, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear, "this child claims he understands international finance. Fascinating." Laughter echoed against the marble walls. Even the judge smirked. Eric felt his face burn with humiliation. The notebook in his hands suddenly felt childish, the scribblings of a delusional boy pretending to understand the world of powerful men. Eric's mouth went dry. His palms were sweating. He could feel his mother watching from the back row, her hands trembling in her lap, her face pale with fear. She had begged him not to come forward, knowing the risks, but Eric couldn't stay silent, not when he understood exactly what he had seen. If you are enjoying the story, type 5 in the comments. And subscribe for more videos like this. If not, type 0. It helps me create even better content for you. Continuing. Mr. Tamburello circled Eric like a shark, his expensive cologne wafting through the air between them. Every step seemed calculated to intimidate, to diminish. The ICU prosecutor who had called Eric as a witness looked uncertain now, as if regretting the decision to put a teenager on the stand against Chicago's financial titans. "Tell me, Mr. Parker," Tamburello said, voice dripping with venom, "what's your highest qualification? Middle school math? Maybe a YouTube tutorial?" Another ripple of laughter cascaded through the courtroom. Several of the accused businessmen leaned back in their chairs, visibly relaxing. This was going exactly as they had anticipated. The threat was being neutralized before their eyes. Eric lowered his head, wishing he could vanish into the floor. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, harsh and unforgiving. He felt exposed, as if his very soul was being dissected for public amusement. "My mother taught me," he mumbled, immediately regretting the words as they left his mouth. Tamburello snorted, making a show of looking incredulous for the jury's benefit. "Ah, a homemade education. Perfect. We are really setting a high bar for credible witnesses these days." The judge chuckled under his breath, not even attempting to hide his bias. In that moment, Eric understood with crystal clarity, this room wasn't designed for justice. It was designed to protect those who could afford its true services. Through the fog of humiliation, Eric caught sight of his mother in the back row. Nancy Parker sat rigid, her back straight despite the weight crushing down on her shoulders. She had raised him alone since his father abandoned them when Eric was 4. Every day she taught mathematics to uninterested high schoolers, then came home to teach her brilliant son the advanced concepts that public school couldn't provide him. She had nurtured his gift despite having so little to give, except her knowledge and her love. The look in her eyes now wasn't fear anymore. It was something deeper, a fierce, desperate faith. She believed in him, even now, even here. In this temple of power, where they were both outsiders. Eric wanted to scream, he wanted to cry, but instead he took a shaky breath and opened his battered notebook. Inside were pages of diagrams, calculations, flows of money meticulously traced through a maze of corporations. His voice cracked as he spoke. "If I may, I can explain." More sneers. One reporter even whispered loud enough for Eric to hear, "Poor kid's about to embarrass himself." And perhaps he would have if not for what happened next. As Eric began to speak, his initial tremor gave way to a calm certainty that seemed to come from somewhere beyond himself. Numbers had always been his sanctuary, his private language, and now they flowed through him with perfect clarity. He didn't just explain what he saw, he reconstructed the entire scheme, how the companies were structured, how the money moved, how fake invoices were created to legitimize theft. He cited international laws, specific financial loopholes exploited by the accused, and patterns so intricate that even the top forensic accountants in the room were caught off guard. "If you'll direct your attention to Exhibit C," Eric said, his voice growing steadier with each word, "you'll notice that the subsidiaries formed a perfect circle of transactions, each one timed exactly 30 days apart. This isn't coincidence. It's deliberate scheduling to avoid quarterly reporting requirements." He didn't falter. He didn't stumble. Instead, he moved to the evidence board and began adding his own notations, drawing connections that had been invisible to everyone else. The judge leaned forward, his earlier smirk replaced by an expression of growing astonishment. The boy, who had been mocked like dirt beneath their feet, now spoke with a clarity, a precision, a terrifying brilliance that no one could deny. How could a courtroom of highly paid professionals have missed what this teenager had pieced together while cleaning office floors at night? But will they believe him? Or will the power of money and influence ultimately silence the truth this brilliant young man has uncovered? The answer might surprise even those who think they hold all the cards in this high-stakes game of financial deception. As Eric continued his explanation, the atmosphere in the courtroom underwent a profound shift. The initial mockery gave way to confusion, then to a reluctant attention, and finally to a stunned silence. Even Tamburello had stopped his pacing, now standing frozen with his expensive fountain pen suspended mid-air. "The movement of funds through the Cayman Islands wasn't the end point," Eric continued, gesturing to a complex diagram he'd drawn. "It was merely a diversion. The actual funds were channeled through a series of smaller transactions to these 3 shell companies, all of which share the same postal address in Luxembourg." The courtroom fell into complete silence. Tamburello tried to object, stammering something about speculation, but the judge, now wide-eyed and leaning forward, motioned for Eric to continue. The defense attorney's face had turned an alarming shade of red, his previous confidence evaporating with each passing minute. "Your Honor," said the prosecutor, who had been as surprised as everyone else, "I'd like to enter Mr. Parker's notebook as evidence." Eric kept speaking, explaining how he had first noticed the pattern while emptying trash bins in the corporate offices. A discarded printout with partial numbers had caught his attention because the mathematical pattern was flawed, intentionally flawed in a way that only someone with an intuitive understanding of numerical relationships would notice. "It's like when a musician hears a wrong note in a symphony," Eric explained. "The numbers didn't harmonize, they created dissonance." Several jurors were now frantically taking notes. 2 of the defendants were whispering urgently to their attorneys, their faces ashen. The reporters who had been dozing in the back row were now fully alert, their pens moving rapidly across their notepads. When Eric finally closed his notebook, his hands still trembling but his eyes blazing with unshakable clarity, no one laughed. No one even breathed. The courtroom seemed suspended in a moment that would forever divide what came before from what would come after. The court's lead financial expert stood up, pale as a ghost. "Your Honor," he said, voice hollow, "this young man's analysis it's flawless. It's better than anything our team compiled. The pattern he's identified, we completely missed it. Did anyone else see this coming? a 16-year-old boy from the wrong side of town, armed only with his notebook and mathematical genius, bringing Chicago's financial elite to their knees. The defense collapsed like a house of cards. Tamburello's carefully constructed arguments shattered against the irrefutable logic of Eric's testimony. The smug smiles were gone, replaced by grim recognition of impending defeat. One of the defendants buried his face in his hands. The judge took off his glasses, rubbing his eyes as if trying to process what he had just witnessed. Then he looked at Eric, really looked at him, not as the poor boy from the slums, not as the teacher's son, but as a mind no one could afford to dismiss. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Parker," the judge said quietly. "This court owes you much more than that." Tears blurred Eric's vision as he glanced at his mother, who had buried her face in her hands, sobbing. Whether from relief, pride, or the release of months of fear, Eric couldn't tell. Perhaps it was all of these things. The billionaire defendants, whose arrogance had filled the courtroom hours earlier, now sat ashen-faced, defeated not by an army of lawyers or by political pressure, but by a skinny boy who everyone thought was nothing. A boy who cleaned their offices at night while they plotted in boardrooms by day. As the judge called for a recess to examine Eric's evidence more thoroughly, the courtroom erupted into a buzz of conversation. Eric stepped down from the witness stand on shaky legs, feeling oddly hollow despite his victory. The truth had been spoken, heard, and acknowledged, but at what cost? His mother pushed through the crowd to reach him, enveloping him in a fierce embrace that smelled of chalk dust and the cheap perfume she saved for special occasions. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered against his hair. "So proud." But Eric could feel her trembling, and he understood her fear. They had just made very powerful enemies, people with resources and connections that extended far beyond this courtroom. The future suddenly seemed uncertain in ways it hadn't before. As if reading his thoughts, a hand fell on Eric's shoulder. He turned to find an older man in a modest but well-tailored suit standing behind him. "Mr. Parker," the man said, his voice gentle but authoritative, "my name is Gregory Wilson. I'm the Dean of Mathematics at Chicago University. I wonder if I might have a word with you and your mother." Eric blinked in surprise. "Chicago University? But why?" Wilson smiled. "Because in 30 years of academia, I've never seen anyone with your gift for numerical analysis, and because talent like yours needs protection and nurturing, especially now." Nancy Parker tightened her grip on her son's arm, immediately suspicious. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Wilson?" "A full scholarship for starters," Wilson replied, "and a secure place in our advanced mathematics program with appropriate mentorship and resources." Before Eric could respond, another figure approached, a severe-looking woman in a crisp FBI jacket. "And we'd like to offer you an internship, Mr. Parker. Your skills would be invaluable in our financial crimes division." The reporters, who once scoffed, now scrambled after him, shouting questions. Scholarships were offered before he even reached the courthouse doors. Universities sent emissaries, government agencies extended invitations, offers rained down. Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated because of their background or appearance, only to prove everyone wrong with their abilities? Share your experience in the comments below. But Eric didn't smile. The validation felt hollow, somehow tainted by the fact that it came only after he had proven his worth in their terms, by their standards. Would any of these people have given him a second glance yesterday? Would they have seen his potential if he hadn't performed for them like some mathematical circus act? He held his notebook close to his heart, walking past the golden columns and polished floors of the courthouse, knowing that no wealth or fame could ever mean as much as the journey that had brought him here. His mother walked beside him, her head held high despite the whispers and stares that followed them. Outside, the Chicago skyline stretched toward the clouds, a testament to human ambition and ingenuity. Somewhere in those gleaming towers, more corruption festered, more injustice waited to be uncovered. Eric thought of all the other kids like him, brilliant minds trapped in circumstances that the powerful would never understand. 2 weeks later, Eric sat in Dean Wilson's office, discussing the terms of his scholarship. The case had made national headlines. triggering investigations into several other financial institutions. The ripple effects were still spreading. "You understand, Eric, that this is unprecedented," Wilson said, sliding the papers across his polished desk. "We've never admitted someone so young to our advanced program." "I understand," Eric nodded, his voice steady now. The courtroom experience had changed something fundamental in him. The fear remained, but alongside it had grown a quiet certainty in his own worth. "And you're sure you want to continue living at home? We could arrange accommodation on campus." Eric shook his head, firmly. "I'm staying with my mom, that's non-negotiable." Wilson smiled, seemingly pleased with this answer. "Family loyalty, I respect that." He leaned back in his chair. "You know, when I was watching you in that courtroom, I wasn't just seeing mathematical brilliance. I was seeing courage of a kind that's rare in people 3 times your age." What will Eric choose? A life of academic pursuit, or using his gifts to help catch more financial criminals? The path he chooses might surprise you all. Nancy Parker had taken a leave of absence from her teaching position. The stress of the trial and the subsequent media attention had taken its toll on her health. She sat in their small kitchen each morning, scanning the newspapers for mentions of the case, worrying about retaliation from those Eric had helped convict. Eric noticed how she jumped at unexpected sounds, how she checked the locks twice before going to bed. Their lives had been irrevocably altered, and not all changes were for the better. "Mom," Eric said one evening as they ate a simple dinner, "I've been thinking about the FBI offer." Nancy set down her fork. "I thought you were set on the university path." "I am, but I can do both." Eric pushed his plate aside, opening his ever-present notebook. "Dean Wilson says I can structure my education to include specialized internships. If I focus on forensic accounting and financial crime, I could help put more people like them behind bars." "Is that really what you want? To spend your life hunting criminals?" Her voice was soft, concerned. "You have such a beautiful mind." "Eric, it seems a shame to focus it on the worst of humanity." Eric considered her words carefully. I think what I want is to make sure what happened to us in that courtroom never happens to anyone else. No one should be dismissed because they don't have the right clothes or the right address." Nancy reached across the table and took his hand. "Then that's what you'll do, and I'll be right beside you every step of the way." In the months that followed, Eric's life transformed. The university created a special program tailored to his unique abilities and interests. 3 days a week, he attended advanced classes in mathematics, computer science, and financial theory. The other 2 days, he interned at the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, where his insights had already contributed to 2 ongoing investigations. The courthouse that had once been the site of his humiliation now became a place where his expertise was sought after and respected. Judges who had laughed at him now addressed him with deference. But the greatest change was within Eric himself. The boy who had once hunched his shoulders and avoided eye contact now walked with quiet confidence. He still carried his notebook. Everywhere still preferred numbers to people most days, but he had found his voice and his purpose. 1 year after the trial that had changed everything, Eric stood at the front of his mother's classroom. Nancy had invited him to speak to her students about mathematics and justice, 2 concepts she was determined they should see as interconnected. 30 pairs of teenage eyes stared back at him with varying degrees of interest and skepticism. These were kids from the same neighborhood where Eric had grown up, facing the same limitations and prejudices he had faced. "A lot of people will tell you that numbers don't lie," Eric began, his voice strong in the quiet classroom. "But that's not entirely true. Numbers can be manipulated, hidden, twisted to tell whatever story the powerful want them to tell. Your job, our job, is to make sure they tell the truth." A girl in the back row raised her hand. "But why should we care about rich people's money games? That's not our world." Eric nodded, understanding her perfectly. "Because their games affect our lives in ways we don't always see. For the money they steal could be funding your schools, your neighborhoods, your futures. And because," he smiled, thinking of his mother's courage, of her unwavering belief in him, "sometimes the only person who can spot the lie is someone they'd never expect to be watching." By the time Eric turned 18, he had published 3 papers on financial crime detection, developed a software program that could identify suspicious transaction patterns, and testified in 5 major cases. The boy who had once been mocked in a courtroom had become one of the most respected voices in forensic accounting. But success came with complications. There were threats, some veiled, some explicit. Security measures had to be implemented. Nancy worried constantly, though she tried to hide it. "Maybe we should accept that protection detail the FBI offered," she suggested one evening after a particularly alarming phone call. Eric shook his head. "If we start living in fear, they win. Besides, the best protection is to keep doing what we're doing. The more cases we expose, the safer we become." Nancy didn't look convinced, but she nodded. She had learned to trust her son's judgment, even when it terrified her. 3 days later, as Eric was leaving the university library late at night, a black car pulled up beside him. His heart raced, mind immediately calculating escape routes, wondering if this was the retaliation they'd been dreading. The window rolled down to reveal a familiar face, Gregory Wilson, now his academic advisor and mentor. "Get in, Eric. There's someone you should meet." Cautiously, Eric slid into the back seat and found himself face to face with a woman in her 60s, elegantly dressed, with keen eyes that evaluated him with immediate interest. "Eric Parker," Wilson said. "Meet Margaret Davenport, CEO of Davenport Financial Security. She's been following your work." Eric recognized the name immediately. Davenport FiSec was one of the world's premier financial security consultancies, advising governments and major corporations on protecting their assets from exactly the kind of schemes Eric had helped expose. "Mr. Parker," Davenport said, extending her hand, "I have a proposition for you, one that might allow you to do even more good than you're doing now." The offer was extraordinary, a position creating new security protocols for financial institutions worldwide, protecting billions in assets while helping to design systems that would make fraud nearly impossible. The salary was more money than Eric and his mother had seen in their lives combined. "Why me?" Eric asked. "You must have hundreds of qualified people applying." Davenport smiled, a sharp expression that reminded Eric of a chess player seeing several moves ahead. "Qualified, yes, but not inspired, not driven by something beyond profit or prestige. You see patterns others miss because you're not blinded by the same assumptions. That's rare, Mr. Parker, rarer than genius." Eric felt a familiar tension building in his chest, the pull between what was possible and what was right. "I'd need some conditions," he said finally. "A scholarship fund for students from my neighborhood, and my mother's involvement in its administration." "Done," Davenport replied without hesitation. "Anything else?" "Yes," Eric said, thinking of all the families affected by the financial crimes he'd helped uncover. "I want a percentage of our security fees to go toward restitution for victims of fraud who never got justice." Wilson and Davenport exchanged a glance, clearly not having anticipated this request. "That's unusual," Davenport said carefully, "but not impossible. We'd need to structure it carefully, perhaps as a separate foundation." Eric nodded. "Then I'm interested." As the car pulled away from the curb, carrying him toward yet another unexpected turn in his journey, Eric thought about that day in the courtroom when everyone had laughed at him. The humiliation had been real, the pain genuine. But so was this moment of triumph, not just for himself but for every underestimated kid from every forgotten neighborhood. He knew now what his mother had always tried to teach him, that no math problem, no financial scheme, no system of power was too complex to be understood, that the world could be decoded if you had the courage to keep looking when everyone told you to stop. Eric held his notebook close to his heart, feeling the weight of its pages, the record of his journey from that terrified boy to the man he was becoming. He had won not by fighting back with anger, but by proving, undeniably, that genius can bloom even in the cracked sidewalks of forgotten neighborhoods, and no one would ever laugh at him again. Congratulations. Type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.